Hello, folks, and good morning. Welcome to I guess technically a tier list, but this is really more of just a random recommendations list. The other day when we were doing a stream, there was a discussion that came up that basically was a question over what kind of other srpgs are out there that aren't necessarily part of that whole like fantasy setting, that are aren't sitting there with medieval politics or what have you. How do we break away from the standard three factions and I'm a plucky rebel type of situation? So it's funny because there's a lot of things that can potentially scratch that itch. You may notice a lot of things already on this list that technically aren't even in the same genre, but I just wanted to throw a lot of things out there in terms of stuff that might scratch the itch if you're looking for very particular things, because a lot of times when folks are coming into looking into srpgs, in many cases they'll kind of overlook it with this tunnel vision of like it has to be officially an srpg of this exact variety. And it's kind of like whenever you see roguelike players getting into the mentality of the Berlin definition and stuff like that, which is just like, how do I possibly suck all the fun that this genre can have straight out of the window and shoot it out at the airlock, So anyways, let's go ahead and cover this whole thing, just kind of try to broaden our horizons a little bit, and explain some of the things that are out there. They're not all going to be created equal, obviously, so I'm going to try to mention when things are kind of overall developed better or worse or what have you, but for the most part, this is meant to be approached with a bit of an open mind in terms of, maybe some new stuff that you maybe wouldn't have tried before. So we're going to go ahead and start off with some classics. Obviously, if you've been on the channel for more than 2 seconds, you know full well where the hell Tactics Ogre Reborn's going. That's a pretty standard pick for this genre in general. And I want to point out that there's a lot of different versions of Tactics Ogre itself, and in many cases, the stuff that it does gets very often misunderstood as like, oh, it is specifically, srpg, but then you do some grind and then there's some politics in the background. No, the core feature of Tactics Ogre has nothing to do with the grind or particular, class leveling strategies or whatever else. You may notice every entry of it has had a different version of class mechanics, of combat mechanics, everything. But the one thing that has always remained is that Tactics Ogre is about the adaptive story, about a story that plays out differently depending on the stuff that you do. The story is about the survival of the people, not the survival of, the main characters and their plots or what have you. It's like, no, it is you as a person leading these people and how they adapt to the world around them. That is what the game's about. I mean, that's actually what the series in general has been about, rather. So there's a lot of classics in this particular one. I'm just starting them off because obviously that's what this channel is primarily about. So we've got like Ogre Battle, March of the Black Queen, which takes an RTS kind of approach to the same idea. The translation isn't necessarily that good these days, but it's still a very fun kind of like board game type experience to go back to. Basically just, again, a story that'll play out a little differently every time you play through, and I should point out for those that are unaware, I'd assume most folks on the channel are pretty well aware, but when it comes to the Ogre series, when I say adaptive story and stuff changing, I don't mean simply like, oh, you missed out on a scene because that guy died. I mean that the other characters acknowledge that guy died and will entirely, change their plans based on the fact that they don't have that guy anymore, or something along those lines. People change their plans, they change their reactions, they change everything about their day. You're essentially you're not losing content by losing people, you're getting new content as a result of losing those people. And actually, just to deviate from the series a little bit, this is actually another reason that we've got something like Fallout New Vegas on this list, because it does the exact same thing. We're not losing content by losing people, the story is adapting, it's letting you know, like, hey, this was a real person that died, we care, let's go ahead and adjust the world accordingly. So either way, I love that as a mechanic. By the way, if you hear any creaking in the background, I apologize, that's my desk. Hopefully that's not coming through too loud. I think I got that solved at this point, but let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up for the classics, we've got Ogre Battle 64, again next to March of the Black Queen there. Again, taking a sort of RTS approach, but this is sort of like a middle ground between when it went full Tactics Ogre and when it went Ogre Battle here. Still being in the fantasy realm of things, don't worry, we'll deviate from that in a moment. But basically this one being more of a more down to earth, but still kind of in the RTS realm here. This one definitely has a lot of very kind of like rebel army vibes. There's a feeling that you're constantly making wrong decisions, and that's then an intended part of the experience. Again, very adaptive story where friends can become bosses or just may defect or what have you. It can play out a million different ways. It's a pretty darn long game, so if you were looking for the SRPG experience, you still wanted to stay in that kind of like fantasy realm of things, but you wanted to feel like stuff was playing out differently every single time, and or you liked sexual tensions between your characters, then you have Ogre Battle 64. I apologize for making that joke. It's something that I have to bring up every time because the translation between Yumel and Magnus is hilarious. Like it's supposed to be like a whole brotherly kind of thing between them, but it really comes off like they're trying to get in each other's pants. Anyway, let's go ahead and carry on here. Next up, in terms of the interesting pile, we're actually going to mention Fallout Tactics Ogre here. Whatever. We'll just go with it. Pretend it's a pun and move on. So Fallout Tactics essentially takes the Fallout 1 or 2 general experience and turns it into a strategy game. Whether you want it to be turn-based or real-time is up to you. That is a toggle that you can choose. You can customize your people. You raise your people in your own particular ways. And if one of your people dies, they are just dead. This is the post-apocalypse after all. Actually, I should probably mention that every single one of these games up to this point has had permadeath. It's actually a surprisingly regular thing for the series, yet every time it comes up, Tactics Ogre gets criticized for it. What the hell's that about? Anyway, moving on. So yeah, Fallout Tactics, fun game, a little bit hard to tell what the hell's going on sometimes. But there's actually a mod maker for the Tactics Ogre community that made a rebalance for this at some point, and maybe if enough people notice it, we can get him to go back and finish the mod like he said he was going to. That would be Fallout Tactics Equilibrium, and that mod obviously would be One Vision over here, which has to sit next to Reborn here. Basically, One Vision takes the PSP version, which we're actually going to go ahead and throw over into Classics here. Basically just completely masters the mechanics out of it. I should point out, again, while we're on the subject of Tactics Ogre in particular, between the two of these, One Vision masters the PSP mechanics, Reborn essentially goes for mastering the pacing of the game. It seems like a weirdly specific thing to go for, but basically, One Vision takes a lot of the more plotting aspects of what the PSP version did, with the, ranking bars, with the skill list scrolling straight off the screen, and with the amount of slots on your equipment, and essentially doubles down in that direction, where there's a very big emphasis on kind of not quite min-maxing your people, but making use of the tools that are on hand to try to prepare an absolute ton ahead of time. To just kind of come up with these elaborate strategies of like, okay, when I go into the fight, I'm going to have my ultra heavy guys over here, but they're going to be fairly slow, so I need my light guys over here running some interference while I have my archers over here running debuffs. We're not going to be able to crack through their healing unless we use our own kind of like light sabotage units over here, flank them around the side. Need to have them covered, so we have these debuff wizards over here going off in this kind of diagonal over here. It's very much about the nitty-gritty, whereas Reborn, as I said earlier, is all about the pacing, where there's this bigger emphasis on most units in the field being roughly equal, but then essentially taking advantage of, well, big advantages. Whether it's elemental advantages, whether it's the now far stronger debuffs, whether it's just really good positioning, it basically put all of its focus into the flow of the game. It's a very interesting thing how both of them went off in their own directions like that, and it's really cool to have both versions to switch back and forth whenever you want to. Anyway, let's go ahead and keep on moving before we get stuck here. Next up on the Classics pile, we've got Tactics Ogre Classic. Honestly, I would not recommend going back to that version these days, but it's interesting to go back and take a look at. It's like basically all the stuff that it tried to accomplish feeling-wise with your characters having proper permadeath and stuff is something that Reborn just generally pulled off better in all categories. Basically, PSP and to an extent One Vision, because it was built on top of it, added like a 3 lives system. There's generally a lot more kind of forgiveness in terms of long-term consequences, whereas Classic and Reborn are more about like the here and now losses, Anyway, again, different approaches to the same idea. It's just really cool to have multiple versions. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next in terms of cozy favorites, and favorites took too much space, I just left cozy. Fell Seal. Basically, if you like Final Fantasy Tactics, which we probably... I meant to actually already have this on the list. Where is FF Tactics? It's not this one before you say it's this one. Where are you, FF Tactics? I know I just saw you somewhere. And this is FFT, yay. Come on, Tactics, where are you at? Why are you missing from my list? I'm apparently being very blind today. Oh, here it is. It's probably because I put some text over it. Basically, Final Fantasy Tactics is one of the routes of Tactics Ogre, but more refined and given Final Fantasy class mechanics. It's a very well-written story, but it takes out the branching paths. It has a really fun cross-classing mechanic. Everyone knows what this is. But Felseal is essentially doubling down on that cross-classing mechanic. The story is serviceable, honestly surprisingly well-written considering that it clearly wasn't the main focus. But it just doubles down super hard on the cross-classing mechanic, where basically not only are you merging classes, but there's still individual identities left over from the main class that you're going with. You've got more slots to play around with. You've got kind of a Tactics Ogre-esque thing where many of your weapons will have very specific kind of abilities and attributes and whatever else associated with them, which allow you to kind of twist things around even further. Like, let's say, one example I've said ad nauseum at this point, it's like, well, early on you get an automatic crossbow. It's a unique thing that it's just a crossbow that shoots in an AoE, but the abilities are very freeform. So, if you give an ability that unlocks crits for any type of action, and then combine that together with another ability that allows you to, let's say, heal on hit, and then combine that together with an automatic crossbow that can now crit heal, with a machine gun crossbow, or take it the other direction of essentially have a character that's able to fire spells alongside their regular attacks, and then essentially now they can crit on a basic attack, they can crit on a spell. You combine that in with another ability that inflicts debuffs on those crits. Basically, there's a lot of that kind of card game-esque stacking of different mechanics there. This is kind of starting to step out of the fantasy vibes a little bit. You have some slightly more modern options there. It's actually kind of adorable that you can have a puppy raiser as an actual class. But either way, it's just a very, very cozy experience. You can customize everything down to the behavior of the AI, to what things they're allowed to use. Like, if you personally find that you're getting your ass kicked by the drowning mechanic, then you can go ahead and take that out. You can prevent them from reviving. You can make them revive more. It has a really unique kind of item stock system that I think every srpg should have hands down, because it is just, in my mind, the superior version of how items should be handled. But yeah, really, really solid title. Some of the... I personally really like the hand-drawn aesthetic. Some folks don't necessarily like it, but either way. As far as indie success projects in the srpg space, definitely leading the top of the pile there as far as Felseal goes. Next up, two steps slightly out of the fantasy thing a little bit here. Technically still fantasy, but let's go ahead and mention Pillars of Eternity. So I've heard a few different things as far as the second one. I've played the hell out of the first one. I'm trying to find where I actually left the first one right now on this pile. But basically, Pillars of Eternity is your classic IRPG kind of situation, but it's essentially a more modern take on the whole thing. It has a bit of a different class mechanic, where essentially when you're customizing your people, you have stuff like essentially your wizards being, well, physically strong as well as mentally strong. Essentially just being one of those situations where weak wizards are just going to suck at their job because they physically can't handle it. Either way, it's got interesting customization mechanics. It's got a interesting combat system. It is technically like pause and go, which again, depending on what you're looking for, can be a winner or a loser. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a very fun experience. I'm starting to wonder if I actually overwrote the one for Pillars 1. It does stick out quite a bit. I don't know how I'm missing it right now. Anyway, besides the point. So, as far as Pillars go, personally, I think the first one was better than what I've heard of the second one. But basically, you've got good party customization. Synergies between your units are pretty fun. There's a deflection system on the armor, meaning that if you like that kind of feeling of, the equipment is strong, but the people aren't, there's definitely that in spades. There's... basically, as soon as a counter is established, usually usually something can die pretty quick. And the mechanics are there to support challenge runs if that's your kind of thing. Like there's even a built-in achievement for all of the Pillars of Eternity titles, and this actually includes Tyranny as well, if I can find it. Oh, here it is. Here. Personally, I found Pillars to be one of those cozy experiences. I wouldn't call it an all-time great, but I thought it was a really cozy game. But basically, it has a inbuilt achievement for doing the whole thing, essentially on permadeath mode with one person, so you're never taking any allies, and then you're beating all the hardest bosses in that particular way. It's a very fun game if you want to study the mechanics a bit. There's a lot of like interesting one-off mechanics, like how with your singers you actually put their songs together in order to make their spells work. It's just cool. You can tell there was a lot of love there. Alright, next up, escaping again from the fantasy genre a little bit here, we have another cozy one, and that's going to be Shadowrun Returns, a game that actually has a mod scene associated with it as well. Basically, this is more the game itself is more of a general tool set. It comes with its own campaign. It's not the longest campaign in the world, and it has several pretty well done DLCs, especially Shadowrun, or Shadowfall, I think was it? Or no, Dragonfall? Something like that. The one with the Chinese name. That was the one with that that generally was the best regarded of the bunch, as far as I recall. But either way, I personally like the original vanilla experience. So it's a pretty darn fun game. Cyberpunk setting. You're going as either, I think it was like Street Samurai, Decker, or some other thing. So you're basically like a hacker, which is more or less like just a computer tech specialist, or you can be like a melee gun guy, or you can basically be a wizard. And personally, I just like doing that whole tech thing. You can run around with your drones and hack into security to turn around and help you. It's just cool. It's a fun experience. So yeah, this is also super cheap. Like, this comes up on sale for pennies all the dang time. So if you're looking to scratch that itch, give Shadowrun a go. The graphics are looking slightly more dated these days. But either way, we'll go ahead and continue on there. Next up on the classics, we've got Tactics Advance and Tactics Advance A2. This is, ooh, man, these are oftentimes very unsung in the entry. It's just like, oh, they were just the Game Boy games. But they absolutely kick ass as far as their ideas and mechanics and everything. Honestly, the graphics even hold up, which is impressive. You can play either one of these on your phone in most cases. A2 is a bit harder to run, but to be honest, you can find yourself finding a copy of A2 is actually a bit difficult these days. But if you happen to, have means to go pick up an SD card and also happen to find a DS card that's able to shove an SD card in there, your difficulties disappear quite a decent bit. I know when I was looking over my collection to see kind of where stuff had changed, it was kind of interesting to look at A2 in particular and be like, yeah, this is weirdly rare these days. It's kind of like the DS version of Resident Evil, where it's like it's a really solid entry, but it's super weird how hard it is to get a hold of these days. Anyways, so the thing about all of these is that you don't want to be approaching them from a perspective of it has to be Final Fantasy Tactics but on the go, because technically, yes, it does that. And technically, I remember hearing folks over the years yelling at them for things like, oh, well, they have less slots, so they're less complex. My big thinky brain is just too good for this little Game Boy game. And they have like more classes to play around with. They have more interesting mechanics associated with those classes. I personally really like the idea of equipment being what teaches people to use stuff, because essentially you're locked into suboptimal equipment for the purpose of improving your people, which just feels good. It may potentially cause you to use mechanics that you wouldn't otherwise use elements that you wouldn't otherwise use, or it just gives you early access to try out a skill before going and investing in it, So either way, I personally love that system. Actually, A2 takes it a little bit farther by having this bizarre mechanic where you're basically buying your unlocks through the game in a sense, using the materials that you find, which means that sometimes you'll get early access to stuff, sometimes you'll have later access to stuff. They really took a lot of the stuff that FFT did and expanded on it in ways that forced you to try out new mechanics all the time, and that's really fun. A lot of the story objectives force you to go and try different things. You're not just innately going to go kill something all the time. Sometimes you're going and protecting things. You're going to get particular objectives. Maybe you're supposed to, like, I think one of my favorite ones that I recall from A2 was one where you're basically told, like, oh yeah, you probably don't have to do much for this particular mission. You're protecting one of the aces of this team over here. She's basically this super powerful wizard lady that's just going to show up and absolutely whoop everyone's ass. And so you show up there expecting nothing, and then she shows up. She's like, hold on, I have to get myself ready for this fight first. And she inflicts herself with every single debuff in the game because she's convinced that being in pain is the only way that she can get better. So effectively, she disabled herself entirely for the purpose of trying to do this training method. And meanwhile, you're trying to keep everybody else off her while she's doing this. Like, there's a lot of really, really solid creativity. FFTA is a really cozy one to revisit. A2 just has so much charm. Not to mention the soundtrack is one of the greatest in the genre, no questions asked. You're listening to it right now. If you ever want to have your day improve, go listen to the A2 soundtrack. It will absolutely just, like, tickle you in your brain genitals. It is fantastic. Go friggin' listen to that. Anyway, let's stop flighting FFTA and move on here. Alright, next up, technically this will be in the classics, but this is a series that's still ongoing to this day, and that would just be Disgaea in general. I'm just using Disgaea 2 because it's the one I'm most familiar with. Basically, this is technically kinda sorta the medieval fantasy setting. However, this is more of a medieval setting if you happen to be on an acid trip at the time kind of setting. Nothing makes sense, and that's intentional, and it leads to some very interesting kind of strategy approaches, like literally things like throwing your own people, just like lifting them up and just throwing them across the map. Just stupid crap like, hey, this unit over here explodes if I just pick them up and throw them at their own people. I don't have to worry about that anymore. It's a very, very three-dimensional feeling strategy to most Disgaea games, and it feels really good. Like, they've got a lot of fun map interactions. Actually, I find it particularly funny that, like, Tactics Ogre Reborn got criticized so hard for adding on-field buffs, and then this guy has just been sitting here like, we've got giant glowy tiles, and nobody questions it because it's so trippy to begin with. Anyway, but yeah, so either way, a fun series. Every entry's just got its own stuff going on. Honestly, it's hard to necessarily recommend one or the other. I know personally I had the most experience with the ones on the PSP, which is why we've got both this one and ZHP on here, if I can remember where on earth I put that. I say as if it was my choice over the randomization and where this stuff all landed. Either way, once we find ZHP, we'll add it to the list. Until then, I have no clue where it is, and I'm just going to keep staring at a bunch of tiny, colorful squares. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on next here. Next, in terms of cozy, fun experiences, right here next to Fellseal, we've got Monster Sanctuary. And I apologize that some of these are going to be a little bit hard to read, but it is what it is. We'll get to it. So, Monster Sanctuary is effectively, like, have you ever played a Pokemon game and you thought, you know what, it would be really cool if we had this kind of strategy, but it was just kind of on the serious level right from the get-go, and there was more interesting stuff going on in the map. Because basically that's what Monster Sanctuary is. You are essentially using 3 of your 6 monsters at any given time. They have an interesting momentum mechanic where essentially every action carries on throughout the end of a round. So, like, it's a 3v3 fight, you have a maximum of 3 in your party. The actions of the first one will multiply the actions of the second one, which multiply the actions of the third one, meaning that you're kind of incentivized to be like, okay, I buff up in my first round, second round we do some recovery, both of these are multiplying in their own ways, and then we have our big explosion move on the end, and basically swapping your people around, going through the very vast amount of perks every one of your monsters can put on hand, leads to a lot of really fun strategy and synergies and whatever else, and you have those moments where, you, like, at the end of your turn, you've just got like 20 effects going off at the same time. And it's just like, okay, they had a full health bar, but now they're at like negative 300% of their health bar. Wonderful. I'm glad that plan worked out. But either way, really fun, frenetic experience. It's basically a Metroidvania meets Pokemon, but you're using all of those team mechanics at the same time. Really fun synergies between your units, really fun map interactions as far as exploring around. They even have built-in stuff like Nuzlocke modes and whatever else, which actually don't lock you out of, like, you know how like in Pokemon you'd have HM moves? In this case, like every one of your units will have essentially abilities that they'll have with them. Additionally, I should point out there's even built-in randomizer modes. So if you wanted to have that situation of like, oh well, I can't get that chest over there because I don't have any birds to go fly up there, but it's okay because I've got this guy over here that lets me turn into a morph ball. There is so much love in Monster Sanctuary. I love it. But yeah, so we'll see. Actually, Felseal and Monster Sanctuary, apparently these two devs are to some degree working together on something Tactics Ogre-esque, so I know I mentioned that a few times, but I can't wait for whenever that happens. Okay. I mean, hell, that setting, I don't even know if you'd count it as medieval fantasy as much, considering that you're fighting robots at times, but anyway. Actually, speaking of devs, because Team 17 was involved in this one, let's go ahead and talk about Worms. So Worms is technically not an SRPG, though they have occasionally thrown in RPG mechanics, but the strategy is very, very fun. I mean, I know that sometimes when I'm playing Tactics Ogre or whatever else, sometimes it's just about the physics. It's that feeling of just, you know what, that guy's pretty tough. He wouldn't be so tough if I just shield bashed him off that wall over there. And that's basically what Worms is entirely built around. You have your team, you use your physics and weapons and whatever else to kill the other guy through whatever means necessary. And on top of that, a good solid, like, half the games in the series have really fun map editors and stuff like that. So this isn't necessarily, you know, an SRPG in and of itself, but hey, they got numbers above their heads, and there's essentially strategy involved, so whatever, we're gonna count it. Either way, this has regularly scratched the itch for me. I know personally, whenever traveling around and whatever else back in the day on my PSP, I always had like Tactics Ogre, I had my Armored Core, I had my Worms Open Warfare 2, I had my War of the Lions remake, I had my Disgaea 2, I had my Front Mission 3, which is going to be next on our list of just absolute classics. If you haven't played Front Mission 3, just go do it. It is so solid. It's a very weird game, which is why it's not necessarily going into, like, the all-time greats. But actually, screw it, it's going in the all-time greats. Front Mission 3 absolutely kicks ass. Okay, basically, you have your custom robots, you have your SRPG stuff, and you have a skill system that works entirely at random. So basically, every one of your parts has a ability associated with it, and if that ability is relevant, it has a chance to trigger. If it triggers, you can add it to your operating system, and then you basically just have a list of selected abilities that can trigger all at the dang time, which can lead to hilarious things like, I have a, you know, rifle in this one hand, I have a shotgun in this other hand. Okay, well, double triggered, so now I can fire both of those, and rate of fire triggered, so now I can fire both of them twice. And okay, well, I guess we've got some kind of other, like, no ability point requirement that's going to trigger after that. And essentially you just keep triggering your abilities over and over and over, occasionally leading to those situations where you've managed to attack 7 or 8 times in a row, and then just, you know, get to attack again. Is it a bit random at times? Sure, but it has so much charm. Like, I really am tempted, just on mechanical simplicity terms, like for actual strategy stuff, to put it down to classics, but dude, it is great. It is definitely one of the greats in my book. It has a really cool internet system associated with it, where you literally can just, like, go hack into the in-universe equivalent of, like, the Pentagon or something, and just order yourself banned parts. There's a lot of really cool ideas here that it definitely deserves to be in the greats pile. Okay. Next up, we've got Frozen Synapse. Now, this is one that I've heard praised ad nauseum. I'm putting it in cool ideas just because, like, I love the idea behind this one. I haven't personally experienced it enough to necessarily put it, you know, as one of the greats or classics or what have you. But basically, it's a tactical shooter in a sort of virtual screen type of setting. But you're going and you're planning out all of their shots and angles and bounces and all of this other stuff, kind of like in sort of like a slow-mo type of thing. Like, you're basically slow-mo picking your actions and attacking and whatever else. Which actually reminds me, I forgot to put Wandering Sword on this mix. I don't even know what you'd count that as at this point, but it's just interesting that it came out. It's actually been unique as far as being a, like, Chinese sword fantasy thing, which apparently appeals to a lot of people. I have no idea what it is outside of occasionally watching Kung Fu movies as a kid, so either way. Like, my brother and I would just watch him all the time. We had no idea what was going on. It was just, hey, that guy got his ass kicked in a really, you know, flashy way. That's awesome. Anyway, so yeah, frozen synapse is basically you're slowing down time and going and taking actions for all of your soldiers, just kind of telling them how to breach and clear multiple rooms and whatever else with a sort of 3D view of everything. It's I mean, yeah, it's pretty darn cool. It's a cool idea. It's actually funny how it's basically available on everything, including a PS Vita, which personally I thought was very, very, very difficult to control, but you do yourself. Ah, that's good coffee. All right. Next up, in terms of, this is technically not a medieval fantasy setting. This is more of just a medieval, oh god, everything sucks setting, which is going to be Battle Brothers, which is also going in the cozy setting here. Basically, this one does not have a story. You don't play this one for the story. You play this one for the interesting battle mechanics, where you've got units specifically posting up with shields to go go block particular attacks in one direction. You've got your hound masters with their longbows off in the back, sending out their dogs to go chase down one guy while going and firing at another. You've got your spear guys behind your shields attempting to get pokes at longer ranges, but you've got your club guy over there that's just trying to break through the armor of another guy, and essentially it just leads to this very interesting gridlock, kind of brutal fighting between all your people. And it's funny because it basically plays as a roguelike. Your team, if anyone dies, if they're downed, they're just dead. They just got their skull caved in, they're not coming back from that. It's a very realistic combat kind of thing. Somebody gets some chainmail, it's like, oh no, they didn't +1 their chainmail. Like, no, dude, that guy has chainmail on. It has a chance to protect him from those attacks. And you visibly see their armor breaking as they're getting hit. Like, oh man, it's so good. Like you see those cases where somebody's shield splinters apart and their helmets break into pieces, and you see their chainmail gets ripped off by that axe, but then they have just enough left in the tank to go throw a javelin through somebody's face, and you just see the javelin fly through their eye in a bloody gory mess as they fall down. It is a badass experience. So yeah, Battle Brothers, it doesn't have a story. You're just doing like mercenary stuff as your mercenary band is traveling all around or whatever else. But hey, if the experience of an extremely brutal like Viking fighting strategy game where you're traveling around under the banner of a topless mermaid appeals to you, then 100%, you will love this experience. The only downside for Battle Brothers is that it has a tendency to be frickin' expensive, which is personally why I would recommend the Switch version. For some reason, it comes up way cheaper when it goes up on sale. I don't know why, but either way, needless to say, I did panic a little bit when my daughter was playing the Switch. She found all these old strategy games. She loved, Mario Rabbids and all that, and when she was asking what this one was about, I said it's a strategy game. She's like, hey, I like those, and then clicked on it. I was like, oh no, we're gonna have to exit out of that one immediately. Anyway, moving on. Speaking of stuff that was scaring kids on the Switch, let's go ahead and talk about Hard West and Hard West 2. Now, these aren't going into the interesting category because of being bad in any particular way or anything. They are very interesting games. I'm just putting them here because it just feels like the right place to have them. So, Hard West 1 is kind of like almost like an Oregon Trail type of experience here. Shoot, I forgot. I just noticed I forgot to put Banner Saga on here, damn it. Anyway, always forgetting something. So, either way, these are basically Western SRPGs with a sort of fantastical element to them. I would say it's more like a folklore mysticism type stuff going on. Hard West 1 is basically about surviving the brutalities of this, grim West and whatever else, of dealing with all kinds of weird mystical threats and whatever else. But its big thing is the fact that you're using a lot of the terrain to your advantage. Like, you're going and you're pulling up a well lid to use as a shield. You're closing up windows to block off lines of sight. There's a lot of physicality to the fights, and that's really, really cool. Meanwhile, Hard West 2 takes a more mystical approach to it. Wherein essentially you're a bunch of bank robbers that end up robbing a train that happens to be headed straight into hell. And so it's like the story of like an outlaw, a witch, an Indian, and a zombie, and I guess whoever else you happen to recruit along the way. But it has this interesting, what's known as a bravado mechanic going on, where basically every time you accomplish a kill, that unit's actions are restored. So this leads to a really, really big emphasis on kind of momentum mechanics and what have you. So like your items are free, your turns get reset upon getting a kill or what have you. So you have those cases where, you'd be going and setting up, setting up these long chains of somebody who just run up and brutalize like 8 units in a row. It's a really fun thing. The only downside of it is install size. Like 30 gigs for an SRPG is like, it's pretty much second highest in the genre as far as I'm aware. So, actually, no, I think it might literally be the highest now that I think about it. Because I was thinking XCOM 2, but I was thinking when it had its mods, even with the vanilla game, even with the DLC, is like 20. So, either way, it is an insanely huge install size. Otherwise, I'd have it on my Steam Deck more. But yeah, really cool game, though, if you have the free space for it. Okay, next up in the cozy pile, Into the Breach, from the people that made FTL, which is also, it just gets to be a classic. FTL gets to be one of the greats. Basically, these guys are really good at making a sort of, I would say, like a Doomsday strategy experience. So we're going to talk about Into the Breach first, where the idea is that you are essentially a time-traveling robot trying to save the future before things get bad. So you go back with your mech and your pilot, and you're trying to either send resources back to make the next attempt a little bit better, or you're trying to kind of get through the fights and handle everything yourself. There's a time reset mechanic that happens during your fights. You absolutely know what's going to happen during every one of your turns, but your ability to control everything and kind of carry through with what limited resources you have leads to a lot of very perfectionist gameplay in the fight sense. So it's really, really cool on that front. The art is amazingly well done. The music is really solid. Gameplay in general just feels very solid. This is another one of those that came out on a lot of different things. Actually, wait, no, it didn't. I'm thinking FTL. No. I think Into the Breach is PC only still. Shit, that actually got way more recommended all of a sudden. Okay, so Into the Breach, it turns out, is actually free from Google Play if you have Netflix. I had no idea that was a thing. Apparently that is a thing. So I just got Into the Breach on my phone. Anyway, good discoveries are good, but it's also on other devices as well. But either way, really good experience in general, really good strategy game, very perfectionist kind of game. FTL, on the other hand, is almost the total opposite. It's like well, that is to say, it's still an awesome game, but it's a very stop-and-go experience, wherein you are playing as the crew of a ship that's trying to get away from essentially a rebellion that just overthrew your kind of galactic federation there. So you are basically playing in a sort of Star Trek-esque setting, and you are escaping from this rebel group there. So all along the way, that you can only spend so much time in each area. There's 8 areas for you to go through. These areas are kind of not only randomly generated, but shuffled around with every playthrough. And essentially you have your choice over, higher risk routes that potentially give you better rewards, or lower routes that are a bit safer. And you have to manage your fuel, your heavy ammunition, if you happen to be using heavy weapons on your systems there. Your systems damage, like let's say you run into a fight where there's meteors flying around all over the place, there's artillery firing from a planet below, you have your primary source of weaponry on this thing is a charging up artillery beam that'll manage to cut straight through their shields, but only a certain amount of them. And so in order to get their shields down, you're firing your missiles to try to break down their shield system. Meanwhile, they're trying to board you, and so you're basically going and using your airlocks to try to lock them out of one room. So you go and send your engine engineer over there to go hold the door system to keep them suffocating in those rooms without air a bit longer. It's a really, really, really solid experience. If you've never played FTL, my god, you are missing out. I don't care if you say it's not technically an SRPG. Dang it, they're like, its class is a roguelike, but it plays, again, as an SRPG. You're still moving them around tiles on your ship. They still have individual skills that are getting better over the course of the game, and basically if somebody dies, they're just dead. The idea is, again, the story of survival of your people trying to get through this experience. If you haven't played FTL, it's easily one of the most recommended things on this list. It looks simple, but man, you feel it. You feel that one. Everything that shows up in the greats, you feel that one. Actually, I'm kind of tempted to put Front Mission down into classics, because it's more it's more in the really fun category, more so than necessarily an all-time great. Okay. So let's go ahead and continue on then. Next up in the interesting pile is going to be Berwick Saga. So this is actually going to be specifically to contrast another one that we'll mention in a little bit here that did a lot of very similar things from the indie scene. But anyway, imagine if you had a Fire Emblem. This one is a straight fantasy setting, but more of a kind of a political medieval setting, more so than fantasy, I suppose. But either way, political thriller. But you've got a lot of logistics involved in your Fire Emblem is the best way to put this one, where like certain units, for example, or certain classes will always fight to the death, attacking again and again and again until somebody dies. Or in other cases, you've got units that specifically are good at going and forcing other units to surrender. Or, for example, there's logistics trains of getting ammunition over to artillery in the background, and you can go and disrupt their logistics there. Or you can have any of your people mounted or unmounted as the fight progresses, and manage your own stock of horses or what have you. There's a lot of very unique mechanics that are put together for Berwick there. Originally, the main reason it didn't get any real mainstream appeal, as far as I'm aware, was due to its lack of an English translation. Apparently, it was mostly translated, and then they just kind of figured screw it and let it die. So there is an English translation now. Obviously, PS2 emulation is still a bit of a pain in the rear sometimes, but you can get it working on most emulators at this point. And you can get the pre-patched version, so you don't need to understand all that stuff pretty easily at this point, since it's a relatively unknown title. So that's Tearing Saga, Berwick Saga. Just Berwick Saga was enough to find it anytime that I looked. I don't know what the hell the Tearing Saga is. Supposedly there's other games that the guy did that are pretty freaking awesome. Yeah, don't ask me. I have no freaking idea. Regdrin told me about this one, and yeah, it blew my mind when I tried it. Actually, same thing here for Ring of Red. This is another guy. This was another one that Regdrin was doing videos on a while ago, where it's this interesting setting of an alternate World War II, where for some reason tank technology resulted in developing, walking mechs, more or less. And so you have this interesting strategy where it's essentially support squads and their primary, mech that are all fighting in interesting ways. Like you tell them to go approach certain ranges, fire smoke grenades or fire essentially anti-personnel rounds or what have you, or penetration shells or what have you. Which I believe they mixed up one of them. Like I believe white phosphorus was the one that was used as basically as heat rounds or something. They had a few misnamings, but either way, you kind of figure it out over time. It's a very slow-going and clunky experience. It's meant to feel that way, but just so you know, it can feel a bit clunky. It can be a little bit on the slow side, but it's a very unique setting. Yeah, not really much more to say about that. You take one look at it, you'll probably know if it's your kind of cup of tea, All right, next up we've got, let's see, a few different entries. Okay, which one are you? I'm trying to remember which one this... We'll put you away for just a moment. Okay, next up in the interesting pile, we're going to have... Actually, no, not for the interesting, but for the cozy pile. We're going to have Tyranny. It's like Pillars of Eternity, but you are more or less a servant of a god that is forced to do war crimes in order to save the universe. Very interesting idea. Okay. Next up in the cool ideas pile, we're going to have Ennokos Tori. This is an srpg from years ago now. They're actually still updating to this day. Basically, kind of like the Ogre battles up here, but you take turns and then your squads engage with each other. A whole lot of different counter mechanics going on between your different people. Like, for example, you can train some of your archers to automatically take a shot at any unit attempting to heal. So essentially just like interrupting healing, or specifically putting up shields under very specific circumstances or what have you. There's a lot of kind of very active interplay between your people. It can be a little bit hard to follow at times, but it is a low-cost indie project that's got a lot of heart behind it. So maybe give that a bit of a look, give them some support. It's I was talking with the dev for years there. They definitely seem to have their heart in the right place. It mostly was like one person and whoever they could get to kind of take part in the project over time. I know they had budgetary issues and then just kind of struggled it out and still kept it going. So it's cool to see that they're still around to this day. But if you were looking for an ogre battle like that, had a decent amount of heart behind it, then maybe give that one a bit of a look. It is a little heavy on the anime in some cases, like visually speaking. What are you? Yeah, of course the spam calls would start coming in. Why wouldn't they? Alrighty. I forget what I was talking about. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay. So next up in the neat but weird pile, we're gonna have Metal Gear Acid. So I just want to point out, yes, I do recommend playing it, but neat but weird is specifically going to be a pile of its own for games that take a little bit of, I guess, an open mind to necessarily approach, because there's going to be some great ones in that pile, but you're going to have to take a little bit of a step back and look at this bigger picture, okay? So, Metal Gear Acid is basically an srpg, but it's also a card battling game, but it's also like a stealth action game. Yes, that is a whole bunch of incongruous ideas that you wouldn't expect to see at the same time. But it's got a really, really cool mechanic in which you're basically, like, every turn you're drawing cards, you're moving along, doing the, your whole chessboard thing, but you're also avoiding guards, trying to avoid detection, and or directly taking people out, because there's additional reinforcements every time you try to fight things directly. At the same time, you're definitely no slouch when it comes to being able to dish out punishment. However, no matter how strong your deck gets or your people get, basically you're going to burn out after a few rounds of attempting any kind of heavy combat whatsoever. You're simply just not going to have the cards to proceed anymore, which leads to this interesting prep system where every character has a grid. Essentially, they start off with 2 cards that they can keep prepared. This goes up to a 2x2, and then to a 3x3 grid. And basically, if you're using that grid, every card that's placed on this grid will affect something else in a particular direction, and or will have some kind of action that takes place under whatever circumstances. So, like, if you put on some body armor, it'll basically say, okay, for 1 hit, this will take away 100 damage from that hit. Or if attacked from the front, you are guaranteed to dodge an attack from the front, and then it'll essentially burn through that card. Or, for example, you'll have cases where it's like, okay, I have this handgun over here that'll counterfire, but it'll also increase the power of any card over to the left while weakening whatever card is above it, stuff like that. And this leads to a lot of interesting synergies where you can be like, okay, I have this thing that'll attach to my pistol over here that says that for the next few rounds, any shots fired with that pistol, while it's equipped, will cause it to inflict bleed and knockdown. And then at the same time, you can be like, okay, I have this other card over here that extends the duration of existing cards, or this one over here that it reduces the time cost of going and using specifically firing cards. And then specifically this other one over here that says that you can keep reusing the same kind of attack card that you're using as ammunition for your equipped weapon, because if you have 2 of the same type of ammunition card, you can use it to fire that weapon. Basically, there's a lot of really fun mechanics that turn it into technically not an srpg, but as far as I'm concerned, it's absolutely tangentially in the same direction there. But, like, yeah, it's a really cool approach. I should point out, Metal Gear Acid 1, though, is a little bit on the clunky and slow side. The maps are a little bit bigger than they need to be. Realistically, for a game that you can only move 2 people at any time whatsoever, even when you have cards that extend them to 3 actions per turn, it takes you a really long time to get from point A to point B. So if there are those cases where simply the task is run all the frickin' way across the entire in-game map, it can be a real pain in the ass. Great to play on a phone, though, just because you can just, save state it and put it away. On a PSP, I mean, granted, you can just put it into sleep mode, but I found it a lot less enjoyable on the PSP. Its sequel, however, goes into the cozy pile. Metal Gear Acid 2 refines everything about the original, and actually had Kojima taking part on this one as well. Not to mention, it is such a love letter to the entire series up to that point. Like, it just blew my mind for it to do these things. Like, oh, you can use the bullets from the SNES guns to go use the Game Boy the Game Boy guns over there to then go get past that guy's defenses that came from MGS3. It's got so many cool callbacks, so many cool ideas. I mean, I love how the final boss even just basically pulls the wool straight off of like, well, that guy was supposed to be the final boss, but screw it, I guess whatever, let's just fight. And suddenly they just go and they throw away their deck of cards. They're like, what are you doing? And they're like, oh, well, I figured since we're supposed to have a big last fight, I figured I'd just copy whatever you're using so we can make it fair. It's so good. It's so good. The writing knows it's complete crackpot and doesn't even care. MG Acid 1 tried to make a weird, mysterious story. MG Acid 2 is just like, screw it, we know what you're here for. You want a challenge to go, detonate 27 Claymore mines in a row to get this guy from one side of the room to the other side of the room before he's even detected you? Oh yeah, dang right you want to do that. It's such a joy. It's just basically this complete joy of violence game that I love going through over and over and over, and New Game Plus is ridiculous. I love it. Where they're like, okay, this guy's just got like 3 rifles strapped to himself for counterattacks. He's got multiple bomb vests on him. Yeah, go try ambushing this motherfucker. It's great. Oh man, I love MGS too. It's so good. It's definitely one of my feel-good games in that pile there. Okay, let's go ahead and continue on here. So next up in the neat but weird pile, this would also go actually kind of under cool ideas. Okay, this one's somewhere in between these two categories. This one's going to be Crimson Tactics. The name got cut off. I didn't actually notice this until afterwards. You may notice, actually, it's... if you're familiar with the War of the Lions box art, they're trying to reference it there. But basically, Crimson Tactics is a game that's got a lot of really cool ideas to it, but unfortunately came out of the oven a bit early, so it's got a little bit of catch-up to do now, especially on the PR front. I will say, if you're taking a look at this one, please actually observe the mechanics that they're trying to do, not just look at the reviews, because like 90% of them are like, oh, it's, big betrayal, it's not quite finished yet, it got scaled back at the last minute, which sucks, don't get me wrong, but there's so much cool mechanical stuff going on in that game that at least has a chance to actually show itself, Anyway, they did a lot of things similar to actually Berwick there, where they added mounts as part of the system there, except that in this case it's more of a tactics ogre kind of experience. I should point out the story, while it does take some cues from Ogre Battle 64 in terms of its execution, the actual choices don't really seem to make much of a difference at this point, though I have heard from some that supposedly a lot of the kind of like in-game dialogue changes based off a bunch of like little kind of hidden mechanics, like how many people you've recruited or what have you. I don't know. Personally, I'm still doing my review through of this one. The defensive play, though, that's where this one shines. Those cases where, for example, you put somebody on a horse, they don't just stay that same unit, they basically use the horse's health bar now. The horse's health bar is a balance meter that can't be healed, but they now have their range of all their attacks extended sideways by 1, which essentially means that they now take up 4 times as much space, and can hit in a lot of different areas. So like you post somebody up with a bunch of defensive skills, activating their shield to guarantee that they're going to block physical attacks. You park them up in a choke point. You give them abilities like Revenge and Flank, which will cause them to attack if you attack a nearby enemy, or for them to counter for somebody else if they're within the general vicinity. And essentially it just gives you a lot of really interesting defensive options. Again, it's unfortunate this one did come out of the oven a bit early. It definitely earned itself a ton of bad PR for that reason. So it's going, it's got a lot of cool ideas. It's in the neat but weird pile. But again, just give it at least a look. There may be a lot of stuff there that you might actually really like. Truth be told, I don't know how it actually ends. I know I'm personally like 15-ish hours in the game, at the 3rd out of like 6 sections, which supposedly one of those 3 sections is the one that everyone was complaining about, in which case, yeah, that side quest was a little dull, but no, not the end of the world. Either way, I don't know. I don't know exactly how it ends or whatever else, but there's a lot of stuff there that might appeal to you. I know, I saw a post a little while ago that for whatever reason, for some legal reason, they weren't able to actually reduce the price yet to make up for the missing PR. It seems like the intent was there to lower it, and at some point it's going to be lower. I don't know how low or whatever else, but either way, it sounds like they're trying to make a comeback with this one, so give it a look. Again, that's Crimson Tactics. It's got stuff. It definitely needs more time to be wrapped up, but it's definitely got some interesting ideas. Okay, actually, we'll just leave it in cool ideas for now. Next up is... What the hell are you? You know what, let me go... Hang on. Let me pull up another thing real quick, see if I can figure out what the hell this other colorful thing is that I can't remember. I don't remember things, dang it, it's almost like that's a regular running theme. Anyway, let's see, let's go over here, let's go to the pictures. Okay, very Steam Deck problem here. Sometimes when you make a new folder and you're on a Linux device, it won't actually update the folders that are available unless you exit out and exit back in. Okay, that is... Oh, that's Brigandine! That's what it is. Okay, I'm using the new art here. So Brigandine is... I don't know if this would count... I think it would count as one of the classics. So it was re-released on Switch. Basically, Brigandine is another one where it's kind of like Ogre Battle-esque in terms of having large squads with monsters and whatever else, with your essentially your commanders serving as the personality of that squad. Very interesting fights to watch. Admittedly, I'm not super familiar with a lot of the mechanics, but you can approach the story from whatever angle you'd prefer. Your only goal appears to be to win, as far as I can tell. Either way, it looks really darn fun. I haven't had a chance to dive into that one personally, but I've heard a lot of really, really good things. So we'll go ahead and leave it up there. Alright, next up I want to throw in some honorable mentions that are not technically SRPGs, but bear with me because I think they're strategic as hell. We're going to go ahead and start off with Armored Core. Namely, we've got Armored Core Silent Lion /3 as well as Armored Core 6. Why do I keep calling these strategy games? It's because a lot of the stuff that you do in them is essentially built up in the exact same way as a lot of SRPGs would be, where you have your prep phase, where you're going and you're building your machine instead of your team, and then you have your execution phase, where you're going and using the tools that you brought to solve, you know, a fairly vague objective. Whether it's to go blow up the thing over there, or to beat that thing over there, or protect that thing over there. It's, again, a very similar thing, where you're in a three-dimensional space, you're using RPG mechanics of various kinds to address a problem of some sort and gain leverage in your situation. In this case, instead of going and bringing along your knights to do the tanking, maybe you brought along your laser scootum to go and, you know, absorb some of those shots. Maybe instead of bringing along your skirmishers, you just put on some exceed orbits. Or maybe instead of, you know, maybe you're getting trounced by that guy with the laser blade, so you went along and, you know, put on some laser pauldrons or whatever else to go and cause their shots to deflect because they keep attacking you from above. So if you can stagger them while they're trying to hit you from above and respond with a shotgun, that could give you a pretty big advantage. There's that very similar kind of problem-solving, mixing and matching kind of mentality involved in the Armored Core games. So if you've never given them a try thinking like, oh haha, it's stupid robot shooter, you are so wrong. Give it a bit of a try. You might just find that you absolutely love that series. I would personally recommend starting with 3 and then moving on to Silent Line, and then 6 definitely takes a lot of notes from Silent Line, but it's definitely way more intense, just so you know. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on here. Other honorable mentions, if you just like building stuff up and just want a chill experience, I just want to mention Space Pirates and Zombies. It never comes up these days anymore, but it's just a game with a very, very heartwarming history that's... you know, it's one of those little victory projects that made it along the way. I don't remember a lot of specific things other than just having a really chill time going and customizing things. So I'm just going to throw it in the honorable mentions for now. Next up in the cozy pile, we've got Symphony of War. Basically, kind of like what Himeko's story did, but a bit more modern and polished, where you're taking the Ogre Battle, building your team's approach, and then throwing it into more of a Fire Emblem kind of setting in that case. Has a fun mechanic where you unlock classes by being able to logistically support them. So, for example, if you want to convert your guys into cavalry, you need to be able to capture some stables on the map to get more horses. When your people die, they are just dead. You can revive them during fights, but after that they're just gone. You can hire new people. Story characters will join you along the way. And it's got a lot of fun mechanics in terms of the interactions between your units, especially stuff like the ambush mechanic, where you specifically can have, like, let's say, a front line of paladins that are there there to go take the brunt of those hits. Maybe they get a damage boost from going and running long distances, and then you have some skirmishers behind them that'll disappear at the start of the fight and ambush the other guys from behind, attacking their back row units while your front row takes out the front row units. It's got a really fun understanding of a lot of that stuff, and I love that it not only took the Fire Emblem and it took the Ogre battle, but it also went the extra mile and threw in some Age of Empires too, which, like, just bravo! Like, even the tech tree specifically references it. Like, I love that. I absolutely love that the tech tree even looks like the in-game AoE 2 tech tree. Which, speaking of, that also has to go in the honorable mentions. If you love any of this stuff, you probably will love AoE 2. It's just a crossover I've seen constantly, and it's a game that the Definitive Edition is still played to this day. You don't need to buy all the DLCs, though, it's good to support them. Definitive Edition comes on sale for cheap all the dang time, and it is a very, very active and very supportive community. Definitely one of the most positive communities I've ever seen, and it's just fun to watch AoE 2 games, to be frank. And like, to see those stupid situations where somebody comes up with some weird challenge gimmick for a map, and then you see multiple people come up with the same idea of, like, well, we're supposed to keep our king safe, so I put them into a transport ship and move them out to the middle of the ocean, and then, the dev of the map realized this, so they had left a bunch of traps, like, off in the middle of this lake or what have you. There's a lot of creative play that happens for AoE 2. It's been considered the best of the best for what it is for a very long time, for a reason, because they nailed it and they've been polishing that shiny nail for years now. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Hell, that goes in the greats. What am I doing? It definitely goes in the greats. In fact, if we can move honorable... Okay, here. I'm going to have to make a little bit of an exception here, otherwise nothing's going to be in the honorable mentions. Basically, honorable mentions are just going to be the things that are technically not anywhere near an SRPG, but, like, you may get scratched the same itch going in that direction, Alright, next up for classics, Knight of Lotus. I'm going to put it at the front of the classics. It's one of my all-time favorites. It's a game that's not terribly difficult, but the fun stuff that it does with the class system, the attention paid to a lot of the art and animations, the pacing is spot on, and it's another one of those reasons that I've said for a while that Tactics Ogre Reborn is an absolute masterpiece of pacing, because the two of them took very similar approaches of just, like, knowing exactly when you need something and moving it to that exact spot. In TO's case, it was taking a very, fairly unrefined and somewhat clunky experience with the last two entries that, again, had a whole lot of stuff going on, but it wasn't very organized, and then just organized it just to absolute perfection. And then Knight of Lotus just pulled this off, first go. Anyway, let's go ahead and continue on here. Again, for the honorable mentions, I've seen a lot of crossover between, folks that like these other games and Poke MMO. It's exactly what it sounds. You basically take all of your ROMs that you totally obtained in legitimate ways on your phone. I'm not judging you, don't ask. And then it combines them all into an MMO where everybody's, essentially playing all of these classics at the same time, but then they also added more and more community features. Like, there's stuff that I cannot even explain that happens all the time. Like, I was replaying through Pokemon Ruby and was like, oh yeah, I'm having my standard experience, and then some guy dressed as a wolf just happens to start flying across the screen everywhere. I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking at right now, but apparently, like, there's situations where there's people making fusions between Pokemon stuff, just a bunch of custom mons, I guess. But you basically have the classic games, and then it just expands on into straight up crackhead territory. I don't know, but either way, it seems to be a pretty regular crossover at this point. Either way, it's a wild experience. If you've been sleeping on that one, maybe don't. Okay. Next up for, let's see, what do we want to do here? For honorable mentions, again, Deus Ex. Again, another one that would be in the all-time greats for this particular thing. Deus Ex Revision in particular, because it makes the visuals a lot easier to look at. Basically, I've seen a lot of crossover between Tactics Ogre fans, New Vegas fans, and Deus Ex fans, because we all just love stories that will adapt to what we do, and that's... like, it's definitely one of the classics of the genre for a reason. In fact, is it strategic enough to consider it close enough to put in the greats? I think so. And in fact, yeah, screw it, Age of Empires has to go up there. I'm sorry, it's just too good. So we're going to put it up there. Basically, Deus Ex is a game where you're traveling around as a spy. You're not exactly a Twitch shooty sort. All of your fights pretty well want to be planned ahead of time because you're probably not going to hit anything in a direct firefight. Um, but it's essentially a straight RPG that adapts to everything that you do, and there's a lot of little interactions. It's one of those ones where the devs thought of everything, and yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. Um, so yeah, give it a look. I'm pretty sure you know what the hell a Deus Ex is at this point. All right, neat but weird. One-way heroics. So this is one that's available once again on basically everything. The idea is that there is a cloud chasing you like it's FTL or something, but you're an RPG character that's going in one direction, trying to escape away from it. You can't really outrun it, but there are ways to make yourself run faster temporarily. There are ways to temporarily make yourself stronger. But the idea is that you're eventually going to have to turn around and fight the cloud. And basically there's a bunch of different endings, a bunch of different character classes, a bunch of different unlocks, but you're just trying to get things done while running through this open field. Like stopping into a place real quick to do like a side quest in 2 turns, or going and rescuing somebody. There's a lot of different things you can be interacting with in the field. It's a very strange game, but a very fun one. The only one that I've ever seen where nudism is a superpower. But anyway, personally, this is one of those few ones that I just kind of kept playing until I dang near 100% of the thing. But again, very strange experience. It is very strategic in terms of how it plays. It is very silly, but let's go ahead and continue on. Okay. Next up, in terms of all-time greats, we have Open XCOM. Alright, so Open XCOM is a absolutely wonderful experience. It's basically taking classic XCOM, but gives it a lot of modern quality of life features. Lets you play it on your phone, which is personally how I would recommend playing it, because it's basically designed for that kind of experience. You can include in DLCs, or not DLCs. You can include the expansion packs. You can include in mods, like if you wanted to do your like terrifying World of Silence and whatever else, you can do that. So a lot of mods are compatible with it. Not all, but most are going to work just fine right out of the bat on your phone. Whether you wanted your XCOM files or whatever else. It's one that I've seen running before. There's occasionally going to be some fiddliness, just so you know. You do still need the original game files from Steam. But either way, it's a really solid way to play this. And actually, I would basically put Xenonauts also on the same level, but for whatever reason I just noticed that the list did not include it. I added Xenonauts 1 and 2, but I think it actually reached the limit and it didn't add them. So I apologize for that. If Xenonauts was here, it would be going into the cozy pile. Basically, Xenonauts is like the original classic XCOM in this case, but it's an experience where they go out of their way to make you know that you're on a timer, where instead of sitting and kind of building up your base and building up your defenses or whatever else, they're like, okay, you've got like months to solve this shit, and we've got Cold War technology, make it work. And so, by the end of the second month, maybe you can finally afford to send out a Humvee with your soldiers, and then, you're trying to make this Humvee last you for months of fighting here, trying to use this ragtag bunch of stuff that you've put together to be able to go take out, multiple UFOs, defend multiple cities, just trying to stretch everything on a shoestring budget. It's such a good experience, and Xeno 2 is very similar in that way, where you're still, technically on a shoestring. You're still on a very tight time crunch, with all your researches and what have you. And so yeah, it's just very much this feeling that you're overwhelmed, but you're meant to be. That there's no way you're not being overwhelmed here. You're not doing anything wrong. This is just how the game is meant to be, kind of a feeling. But it's an absolute thrill to go through Xenonauts. Like the first Xenonauts still has a very 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 unique kind of dark feeling to it that you don't see that often. Just like that feeling of doom and gloom, but you gotta keep going. And that's one of those ones that you just feel, So either way, Open XCOM is also going to stand in for Xenonauts, is going in with the all-time greats in my opinion. It just basically both of them are that same mentality, but when it comes to Open XCOM, you can mod in sort of Xenonauts-esque features. So if, like, hell, even I think XCOM files and Final Mod Pack, I believe, actually have all of the Xenonauts characters in there. So you have that as well. So if you want to fight your, your Sebis, your Cesians, you have your Reapers in there. Man, for Xenonauts, though, like, I don't think there's anything that directly approaches the absolute freaking insanity of X Division. Like, oh, I'm sorry, the map just got leveled because you thought that robot T-Rex was dead after the multiple pulse shield layers and mode changes? I'm sorry, what? Of course it self-destructed and came back to life like a frickin' laser phoenix. Why not? Why wouldn't it vaporize half the map along with your entire squad? God, that game. Oh man, X Division is one of the wackiest mods I've ever seen in terms of being like still technically fair because it gives you warnings for all this stuff, but you are expected to learn the hard way that stuff is not as it seems all the time. Like, it makes sense, but when you first encounter it, it's terrifying. Just every late game enemy is like that. Where it's just like you're just running down an entire gauntlet of bosses with your rookies by the end. It's something. Okay, next up with the ideas. So, cool ideas for Wasteland 2, neat but weird for Wasteland 3. Admittedly, I haven't gone through Wasteland 3, but from what I've heard, it was trying to like redo what Wasteland 2 did, but try to make it more optimized for consoles. Again, please bear in mind that this is not a put down in any way. Supposedly, it still was very good. I don't personally know. I just know that I love the hell out of Wasteland 2. It's a game that has a lot of interactions in terms of your character's skills being usable in inside and outside fights. Has a lot of fun interactions in terms of preparing fights beforehand. It's just interesting to have those moments where, while you do have your standard XCOM-esque kind of taking cover and shooting type of mechanics, it's cool to see those other ideas where you can still charge forward with melee people pretty comfortably, or you can just end the fight by whipping out a rocket launcher and just blowing them away, because who's got time to figure out whether I can line up a shot or not anyway. Either way, fun game, has a lot of fun choices built into the gameplay and whatnot. I did feel like some of the choices were we probably could have pulled off both, but it's fine. Fun setting, fun character building, and definitely one that I feel could have included a permadeath mode. I will say, if for some reason you're one of those that backed it from the original version, and you're like, wow, I've got Wasteland 2, and I've also got Director's Cut. I'm sure Director's Cut screwed it up. I'm going to play the original. Please don't. Director's Cut fixed one of the most annoying problems. There was very literal shit in that game, which is that in the original, there was a constant issue, less so in the second one, less so in Director's Cut, thankfully. But when it was first launched, that early version, for whatever reason, had an issue that one of the side quests involved you collecting poo for the grenade-making guy. And unfortunately, every container that had it, if you failed to look through it properly, had a chance to explode. Meaning that there was a very regular early-game problem where you would just open containers and explode. All the time. To the point where it led to constant reloading, because even if you had characters that were supposedly, good at their relevant scavenging skills, you still regularly would end up being like, oh, haha, there's guano in this toaster. It's too bad my doctor just died. Every one of these games on this list, I've tried Iron Manning through one ways or another over the years, and that one blew. So, if you have a choice between the regular and Director's Cut for some reason, go with Director's Cut, please, for your own sanity. Anyway, moving on. Alright, next up we've got Silent Storm that's going into the Cozy pile, and then Silent Storm Sentinels that's going into Neat but Weird. Now, objectively, I think Sentinels has the better strategy experience, but there's a reason that, Sentinels goes up there, Original goes up here. Okay. So, this is essentially a World War II shooter, where where you're doing the turns and action point thing, but the fights are extremely physical. This one is all about the physics. So, like for example, you hear sounds. Your soldiers and their awareness will tell you, will show you like little footsteps where they think people are, and so you can have those cases where you go and stand underneath the staircase, you make a noise, and soldiers will run down, and you shoot through this wooden staircase, and you see the individual boards like blowing up and breaking off and flying, and you see this guy just ragdolling, just like pinned against the ceiling with a heavy machine gun fire as all of their grenades fall out of their pocket and to the bottom of the stairs. It is such a satisfying experience. I can't explain that hard enough. During all of it, the campaign is handled in such a way that it's an investigation, where you're given multiple leads to follow up on, but you're supposed to connect the dots. At any point, you can basically just discover the last boss and go there, but it doesn't tell you anything about how to get inside. So, in order to unravel the mystery, find all the key players and whatever else, you're investigating around, you're finding notes, you're trying to capture people rather than blowing them to pieces all the time. Eventually, you get little portable mechs and what have you. It is one hell of a game. Now, Sentinels has way better balance, I will say. Sentinels was its sequel, and it's basically the far more freeform version. You basically had 2 campaigns with multiple routes to complete them for Silent Storm, but then for Sentinels, it basically was just like a freeform but somewhat more linear story where you're fighting this big evil bad, and you have characters from both of the previous campaigns. I should mention that there is a permadeath mechanic in all of this, so if your people die, there's a chance that they can be evacuated. You can... Anyway, you can customize your difficulty. Sorry for the random pause, just allergies and stuff. You can customize your difficulty in terms of like how likely somebody is to completely die or whatever else. But if somebody, like let's say, has a small grenade go off nearby them, and it's one of the really lightly packed ones, there's a pretty decent chance that they'll just be knocked out, but not necessarily killed. But if somebody comes up and just like goes full auto on somebody from an inch away, yeah, it doesn't really matter what your difficulty setting, they're probably getting toasted. So either way, there's a lot of different ways for all this stuff to pan out, but like Sentinels has the better combat, but it has the worst logistics, as weird as this sounds. Because you have this case where now you're going from an organized officially sanctioned squad to being mercenaries, and in this particular case you have to scavenge your own equipment, which is cool, don't get me wrong, I love that mechanic, but they take it a bit too far at times, where suddenly there's just no ammunition available for, certain fairly standard weapons you'd assume would work, or you're suddenly noticing that the bullets from those sniper rifles over there would also fit into your machine gun. So you're carrying around all these, little rifle clips to go reload your machine gun 5 bullets at a time and stuff, which, again, is neat. The main problem for Sentinels is the stealth mechanic, though. Where one of the most annoying things from the original was the stealth skill, that if it was high enough, it could be completely broken. Now, this works great on the player side, but on the enemy side, it gets extremely annoying, to the point where you can have 4 people staring directly at the corner where you can see the bullets flying out of as they mow down all 4 of your people, and none of them have the awareness to figure out where they are. And so you're basically just left like blind firing in what is clearly the one tile where somebody is, essentially attempting to land some shots. And this is especially goofy when you have somebody with high stealth that ends up in one of the Panzerkleins, as they're called, the tank pants there, wherein they're literally in a straight up like steampunk mech, standing in front of you completely invisible because their stealth skill said so. It's absolutely some bullshit. Thankfully, it doesn't come up all the time, but it is one of those games that it absolutely beats you with the bullshit stick pretty regularly. I would say the original was far better paced. But either way, overall, I liked the gameplay of Sentinels more, though, when it was working well. Like, especially the big fortress siege, where you get to deploy all of your soldiers at once, and like you're seeing people falling as they're taking anti-tank shells through their tank suits, and there you got like snipers trying to hide in the grass, and then you got your grenadiers trying to blow away all the tiles on the opposite side. It feels very large scale. Okay, next for neat but weird, we've got Phoenix Point. So Phoenix Point is going to be so for Phoenix Point, it's going to be one of those ones that's they tried to do the classic XCOM thing in a 3D, more modern 3D space. It seems. See, personally, I bounced off of this one for a number of reasons. Largely because it seemed like a lot of the cool mechanics that they were going for were regularly getting phased out in terms of stuff that XCOM had figured out years before it. Wherein they were trying to do this like whole limb destruction mechanic, but then at the same time, and also this like free aim mechanic, but then also in most cases you were still just kind of aiming for damage rather than the limbs anyway, as far as I recall. It had a lot of balance tweaks over the years, and I've heard that it's been improved quite a decent bit. I have seen the scores go up slightly, so it seems to be sitting at about a 70% right now in general. I will say I haven't played this one since early access personally, but from the videos that I've seen, it seems like it's still a bit on the jank side. But still, if you wanted XCOM with free aiming and stuff like that, this would be a fun way to do it. Probably going to revisit this one at some point, but I just haven't really felt like throwing money at it personally, ever since refunding the early access thing. Okay, let's go ahead and carry on. Alright, next up for the cozy pile, speaking of that done right, XCOM Enemy Unknown. Mechanically, it's more simple than Phoenix Point, but it is just complex and just simple enough to be a very, very, very cozy entry into the XCOM series. Where you've got all the stuff that's important while trying to keep the overall complications to a minimum. Those cases, like, I still play through XCOM EU on either the Vita or the phone pretty regularly, just because it's got those randomization modes, it's got, tweakable difficulties and what have you, to the point where you can come in, fighting completely broke, but all of your soldiers are rocking unique random abilities. Just kind of tackling fights with weird units and weird situations. The Long War mod is definitely one of the all-time greats as far as XCOM goes. But either way, the mechanics of it are just really, really fun. The flanking mechanics, the maps are typically just big enough, although the late-game battleships get to be a bit annoying. With the Enemy Within expansion, which basically is included in all versions that you're realistically going to run into these days, Enemy Unknown became a game with a lot more variety in its fights. And yeah, everything from base management to unit management and whatever else feels very tense. So if you like your Iron Man runs and stuff like that, it's one of those ones where it's just fun to get slapped into the dirt, So objectively, I think mechanically this one is worse than its sequel, but it's still the one that I find myself playing way more often because I just find it way more comfortable. And it's just available on more stuff. Meanwhile, I would say XCOM 2 is personally one of the greats. It's one of these ones that is insanely refined in terms of its mechanics at this point. Essentially, you're going to have different objectives, different stuff going on every time you play through. You've got a lot of different unit types to mess around with. Those unit types further not only are customizable, but they will have their own kind of separate randomized skill tree that they can access. The tech paths that you prefer to go down are entirely up to you. Your base management is mostly up to you. I say mostly because realistically, if you're not starting off with a resistance ring, what the hell are you doing? Either way, XCOM 2 Collection is not only cheap, but it's available on frickin' everything at this point. The phone version works better than the Switch, which is just... what is that? Anyway, the phone version or the iPad version is what I would recommend. The Switch version is like a secondary maybe version. It's basically got most of what the other two do in terms of having improved things that normally come from mods. Like the phone and iPad versions will include evac all, will include pictures for every one of your units, will include a lot of the UI mods that people typically go for in the PC version, to the point that I personally think that the original PC version is the worst one to play at this point just due to install size. But either way, all whether phone or console versions of XCOM 2 are excellent in my eyes. PC version has the Tactical Legacy Pack, which allows you to have different soundtracks and what have you. But again, personally, I would say phone, iPad, or Switch on this one would be my general preference. But look up the Interceptor theme from TLP and you'll have yourself a good time. Okay. Next up for cool ideas, we've got Wargroove. I haven't played this one personally, but I watched a good bit of it. Basically, if you liked Advance Wars, you like rhythm games, you've got Wargroove. Next up for honorable mentions, Dwarf Fortress, a game that's been in development for I think like 30 freaking years now. I don't know how long it's actually been, but it's been a very long time, and I believe it still remains in with ASCII graphics. But basically, you're just managing a fortress with a bunch of automated units in there, and you just give orders and hope that they carry them out. But it's the details that matter for this one because everything is modeled. If somebody gets a cut on their finger and they get an infection, and they're getting this infection while reading the Necronomicon, which causes an undead infestation, and their finger falls off and their finger comes back to life and jumps down their throat and kills them, that's a thing that can happen in this game because it's essentially this bizarro fantasy setting where all rules are just on the table. It's I would recommend, at the very least, go watch some playthroughs of Dwarf Fortress to see the weird crap going on there, and you might find yourself completely hooked. It's very difficult to play, but it is one hell of an experience. And if you're looking for that, you want to have that crazy simulation aspect, but you also want it on your phone, you've got something that's similar but not quite the same thing called Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead that's actually available on phones and works surprisingly well. I was really not expecting it to work as well as it does. And funnily enough, you can get it to work on a Vita. We live in strange, amazing, magical times. Let's move on. Okay, next up for honorable mentions, Dark Souls in general. I personally love 2 the most of the series because I just love fun exploration. But either way you do you. Again, same thing as with Armored Core. We're talking about a case where there's just as much preparation, or just as much going into the preparation as to, applying the tools they have on hand. It's got a lot more synergy with the standard srpg experience than it oftentimes gets considered. So just wanted to throw that up there. Next up on my cozy pile, Sots the Pit. I love it. It's essentially, think of it more less like a roguelike and more strategy survival horror, where you're essentially one guy and whatever survivors you happen to find along the way. Well, guy, girl, space dolphin, whatever the hell you happen to be. And you're essentially just going through. You start off fairly loaded with all of your weapons at full capacity and extra ammunition and grenades and food and whatever else, and then you're diving through a 40-floor dungeon in whatever way you see fit. So whether you're MacGyvering together power armor suits to go be able to use automatic rocket launchers that you found, or you're going and hacking terminals to get turrets on your side, or you're welding doors shut in order to keep the 20 frickin' abominations that are hiding behind that thing from chasing you down that hallway. It's essentially a constantly changing puzzle that requires a different approach every time you play through, depending on the stuff that you find, the stuff that you run into. It's quite the experience. So that's Sword of the Stars, The Pit. The latest version is called Osmium Edition, which is just basically going to come in with all the DLC, which you definitely want. Alright, next for interesting is going to be SteamWorld Heist. Basically take the modern XCOM experience, but you're also doing it as a essentially a 2D physics shooter, which is pretty darn fun. Maybe not necessarily for everybody, but I personally found the shooting to be super satisfying. Not to mention there's a mechanic where you're actively trying to shoot the hats off of every enemy in the game so that you can collect them in your hat collection. Alright, next up in terms of cool ideas, we've got Triangle Strategy. Essentially, it was one that originally seemed to want to try to compete directly with Tactics Ogre in terms of being an adaptable story. Unfortunately, most of that adaptation turned out to be, I've heard it described as a Telltale type experience where it'll change something in the immediate moment and then just won't remember in the long term, or won't really change anything in the long term. But still, it's got some fun gameplay. The music is pretty pleasant to listen to. For the most part, it never really seems to really ramp down much, which kind of tends to give me a headache after a while. But either way, it's one of these games that's kind of fun to play through, though the cutscenes definitely drag on, and they don't really get any more interesting, so that part's a bit dicey. Anyway, definitely I would say overall the least value and most price for the thing that you're going to get in the entire pile thus far, but still, if it's on sale and you're looking for a, fantasy kind of experience, then they might be what you're looking for. Alright. Next up in the interesting pile, Jeanne d'Arc. This is one that I've been ordered to try over and over the years, and my stubborn ass kept putting it onto PSPs that I was then selling because I fix up and sell PSPs pretty regularly as a bit of a side gig, and to keep more PSPs out there in rotation. Anyways, so in this particular case, I have gone and put this on what feels like every dang PSP for years, and then just never really got into it because I was like, oh, I'm just gonna go put it on something else. This one's about to sell, and then I tried again, like, oh, it's gonna go to the next one. Okay, I'll try it again. I just tried it yesterday for the first time finally. Where I always like, well, I say tried for the first time, more like I actually fully gave it a few hours. And yeah, this game's got some frickin' energy. Holy crap! Honestly, some of the most fun tutorial screens I've seen in a while. You could tell they were having a blast while making it. I've heard the balance is a little bit janky in terms of the strategy or whatever else, but it's got some serious energy, so maybe go ahead and give it a bit of a look. And then next, well, I guess final on the list because it cut off a bunch for whatever reason. We've got Jagged Alliance 2, which is going to go in the all-time classics, being essentially a game where you're tasked with taking over an island with mercenaries and locals, where you're arming the locals, you're using your own people as kind of the main frontline push, you're trying to defend territory, whatever else. The story is surprisingly funny, as you're seeing the local dictators and their lieutenants react. And then in the cool ideas pile, we're actually going to get sort of its direct sequel in the form of Jagged Alliance Rage, where it's essentially like a solo adventure with a old version of one of the characters from the classic games. Where you're basically doing a lot of the same strategic stuff, but on a much smaller scale. Now, there's several more on this list that I mentioned for whatever reason the website ended up cutting off. So we've got Chimera Squad, which, again, I would say similar to Jagged Alliance Rage, took this idea of like, what if we had a smaller scale adventure within this bigger franchise? So Chimera Squad I would probably put in the interesting pile, where it's taking the XCOM 2 thing, but you're now basically a police force in the post-war world there, trying and either stop or capture several belligerents, trying to pull off various schemes throughout the city. You can't ever take a loss. If any of your people bleed out, then that's the end of that. But it's essentially like a squad shooter strategy game kind of thing that's really fun. The breach mechanic is really fun, where you slow-mo breach through doors and send out gadgets to go make your fight easier, take out bigger threats before the fight even starts, that kind of stuff. Like, it's really fun how you can have the psionic guy go in and start levitating somebody, you have somebody else go and try to throw someone into a nearby tile or like throw them off a cliff or something. You have the other guy send in the drone so that nobody's hiding out of your line of sight or whatever. It's just a really fun time. Xenonauts, I already mentioned, was supposed to be on this list here. I'm sure there's others as well, but I should probably start wrapping it up here. But this was just a list of just some stuff that I wanted to recommend, just to give you an idea that when it comes to that feeling, scratching that itch from an SRPG, like a good SRPG, it may not necessarily be that you're looking for something that is the same experience. You may be looking for something that's kind of got similar vibes. Maybe it's this, maybe it's the tone, maybe it's the writing. Like, if you like the writing from Tactics Ogre, you might like the writing from Final Fantasy Tactics, but the gameplay itself is completely different between the two. Something like Vagrant Story, for example, also apparently got cut out of here, where it would be essentially again be like Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Ogre-esque writing, but at that point it's a solo dungeon crawler adventure kind of situation. So, when you're looking for recommendations for other SRPGs, just kind of keep your eyes open. There may be a lot more things out there than you think. It definitely doesn't all have to be stuck in a fantasy setting. But even then, maybe that fantasy setting has other cool stuff going on. Like with Fellseal, it didn't even feel like a fantasy setting. It felt like we were a cop precinct just kind of traveling around the countryside, Or with Monster Sanctuary, where it definitely gave me more like Dark Souls 2 vibes in terms of the exploration, where you're just seeing pretty locations. It doesn't necessarily have a time frame associated with it. Like it does, but it doesn't, kind of a thing. Where the time is irrelevant, so to speak. Anyway, so that's about that. That's what I got for today. Hopefully that was amusing, and yeah, have yourselves a good one. Take care.